Hello, everybody, and welcome to this very special live stream on Lockdown 2.0, What Next for Workplace Mental Health. My name is Zoe Sinclair, and I am the co-founder of the This Can Happen Workplace Mental Health Conference, and it gives me really great pleasure to be joined today by the This Can Happen partners. So welcome today to Monica Misra, who is the Head of Health and Wellbeing EMEA at GSK. Hello, Monica. We're also joined by Sarah Boddy, who is the Chief Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Officer for EMEA and APAC from Northern Trust. Welcome, Sarah. And we're also joined by Tony Graves, Global Head of Reward and Wellbeing at Allen and Overy. Welcome to you all. So we really are on a very amazing day, I guess, today. We are going into lockdown here in the UK again for the second time. So, Monica, I guess, coming to you first, what does the workplace even look like now? Before we even get onto anything else, it's looking very different to what it looked like 8-9 months ago.
Absolutely. And actually, I'm in the workplace today for the first time after 8 months, and it's much quieter than it was before. Clearly, we still have our essential workers in the workplace, but mainly that's really in order for us to continue to produce products for our patients and consumers. So those sites continue to be busy. As we need to. Sites where we have offices are much quieter because, as you know, people who can work from home are continuing to work from home. And so it's a very different feel coming into the office.
And Sarah, for you, what can we learn from last time that maybe we can help staff with this time?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I think as with most things in life, the second time, the third time, the fourth time you do something or you go through something or you experience something, it's usually somewhat easier than the first time because that degree of the unknown is taken out of it or somewhat taken out of it anyway. So I think there is a feeling that we were there before, we managed to get through it. It was very difficult and very hard, but we did manage to get through it. And that's better prepared us mentally for getting through it a second time. I think also we, in a sense, knew this was coming for a little longer. There's been talk of a second wave, really from when the first wave hit us, that we would see that in the winter time. And all the countries around us started going into lockdown. So consciously or unconsciously, I think our brains will have been starting to prepare for this before the announcement actually came. And I do think both of those things are things that we can take into this second pandemic as good preparation and good things in our mental health that can help us through this period.
Okay, so that's really useful. And I should have said at the beginning that anyone watching on any of the platforms can send in a question or comment and to pose to any of you, and we will come to those shortly. But Tony, I think it's really interesting what Sarah said, because somebody has said to me that actually they might have been more prepared for it this time, but actually last time was, if I can say, slightly adrenaline fueled. We were looking for new ways of working, and there was so much to think about. And actually, this lockdown now has got slightly more of a depressive approach to it.
I think we are definitely seeing that in terms of people's responses, because last time, although there was the initial anxiety about the unknown, as you say, everyone was getting to grips with new technology and new ways of working. And then, of course, you had that period where people really kind of came together to go, and we had all the great stories on the news of, Captain Sir Tom doing his walking and just people helping their neighbours, doing their shopping for their elderly neighbours and things like that. And I really hope some of that comes back, but it doesn't feel as though it's quite there yet. And also, knowing what to expect is a bit of a double-edged sword, because I think last time we went into it thinking, oh, we'll all be back in the office by May. Whereas this time we're thinking, well, it's going to be the winter and it's 6 long months and dark evenings. So I think it's tough for people, definitely.
And Monica, what do you think about that sort of adrenaline fueled first one, and that this one is slightly more solemn and subdued? Are you seeing that in your staff?
I think there's a feeling of chronicity here, similar to what Tony said, is that with the first lockdown, it was something that was unique. And now that we've experienced it and we know all the challenges that we faced during the first lockdown, we can foresee that happening again. So I think there is an undertone of this is more like a marathon. And because of that, it's much potentially harder to go through it, remembering the challenges that we faced earlier. I think also the unknown in terms of the duration, we're hoping it will be lifted in a month, but we really don't know that. And so that uncertainty factor can also be causing issues. I think the fact that also the days are shorter now and it's much darker sooner, it's much harder to look after your well-being in these situations. So it takes a lot more effort to do so.
So interestingly, I was talking to someone recently and they said exactly on that point, Monica, about the days getting shorter, that they have said to their staff, take out 2 hours if you want during the day when you have lunch or when there's light hours. If you need to work later into the night, I don't want you to miss out, especially at this time, on light hours. And I thought that was just such a simple message, but something really powerful. So Tony, turning to you, what other nuggets or how can we keep our staff motivated in this second lockdown?
So I think line managers are obviously really important in terms of staying connected to their teams, but we equally have to remember that I think our managers are also really quite tired because they've got this additional responsibility. So I think looking after our line managers is quite important. But picking up on your point about daylight, I think it's quite important for people to understand what their own rhythm is. So some people will know that they concentrate really well in the evenings. That's not me. Other people will concentrate really well early in the morning. So to the extent that you can and that you have a little bit of flexibility in your day, you can try to work so that you're working when you're working at your best. I do think getting outside and daylight is so important. So if you can somehow position where you're working close to a window, even if you're sitting on a chair with your laptop on your lap, if you're close to a window, you're getting more natural daylight. And try to get out for, even if it's a short walk. I mean, we're fortunate in this lockdown that we can still go outside for exercise. And we can also meet one other person outside in a public space. So we're able to do things, certainly that in terms of meeting someone, that we couldn't do in the first lockdown. Plus with the kind of support bubbles and those sorts of things, people can, so two single people can bubble together. You can have a support bubble for informal childcare. There are lots of things in place that we didn't have in the first lockdown that I think we've probably learned. So, we recognise that people could be extremely lonely and very isolated. And I think some of these things will really help that. A couple of other things that we've sort of suggested. Video calls are great, but I think people are quite fatigued by it now, and they tend to get booked back to back during the day. So if you can book your video calls for 55 minutes instead of 60, use that 5 minutes as you would in the office to walk around to your next meeting, and just do some basic stretches, stretch, stand up, look away from your screen for a little bit. And sometimes think about alternatives to video calls. I've heard lots of people saying that they like to kind of walk and talk. So if it's a one-to-one, you can do it on the phone instead of a video call and get outside and walk while you're doing it. And the interesting thing about that is the quality of kind of thinking and the conversation can actually be really different simply because you're walking and talking at the same time, because just the simple act of movement can help you to manage and stabilize your emotions, actually.
Really invaluable points, Tony, actually. I think all of them I haven't even necessarily thought about, but very easy little wins. And I think you're really right about we have to be, I suppose, grateful that we are in a slightly better position with the people that we can see and the things that we can do this time. But just coming to you, Sarah, how can we still be looking out for our staff? We are still mostly remote. I know you're dealing with people all across the globe. How are people managing to look out for each other when, once again, they're not physically seeing each other?
Yeah. I mean, we are a very international company, as I'm sure many are out there. We have people dotted all over the globe, and therefore many managers who are managing people who aren't co-located with them. And that's the same now for every team. Even if before all of your people were physically together in the office with you, you've almost now become an international manager by default because everybody's not in the same location as you. I think it's really important to up those open and honest conversations about how people are feeling and what support and help they need, being proactive in terms of mentioning it, asking about it. Don't wait for somebody in your team, if you're a manager or a colleague, to sort of say, oh, I'm really struggling. Actually proactively ask about it and proactively suggest things that they might need to do. We all know in theory all the things that we should and shouldn't be doing, but actually getting them done, making time for those in each day is really, really difficult sometimes. And so making time in one-to-ones to have that check-in, but also thinking about all the other things that we would do at this time of year. I know in many organisations there would be Christmas parties, there would be holiday get-togethers, there would be meals out for a team. Have a think about ways that you can do that virtually. Yes, it's not the same, but that doesn't mean that just because it can't be exactly the same, we shouldn't do it at all. I know some teams who are each going to order takeaway, from Deliveroo or whoever in their respective homes, and they're going to have a Zoom Christmas meal. And I just think that's a lovely way of not just resigning to yourself to the fact that all the Christmas drinks and so forth can't happen, but that there's ways around it, and keeping that connection, that social connection with your colleagues is really, really important, as well as just getting on the standard Zoom calls for all of your meetings.
Again, really helpful and very practical. Monica, are there ways in which you are supporting your staff, keeping them motivated at this time?
The one big factor is the connection that we've just heard about, regular connections with your manager and regular connections with team members. I think secondly, what's really powerful is recognizing people. And sometimes when we're stressed or we've got a lot more pressure and we're among these times, it can be easy to fall by the wayside. But I think giving positive feedback to somebody who's done a really good job can make such a difference to their well-being. To give you an example, last week I had somebody emailed me about something that I'd done, and they said that I'd done a brilliant job, and it was totally unexpected, and it really raised my morale significantly. So I would say that remembering to praise and to recognize our people is really important, and never has there been a more important time to do that than now.
Excellent. No, that's a really valid point. Tony, I just want to turn to you. At the conference itself, we've got your managing partner, Gareth Price, speaking at the conference with all senior leaders and CEOs. What role do you think that senior leadership should be taking at this time? Is it a different level to last time? Is it the same messaging? What recommendations for senior leaders do you have?
I mean, one of the things that we've seen which has been really successful is our senior partner has done a blog, and he started it in March and he's continued it all the way through. And he's talked about his own personal experiences, both at home and work, and how he sees the market developing, etc. And I know that our people have really, really enjoyed reading those. I think they feel that they've got to know him better. And given we're an international firm, obviously we've got people in sort of over 40 different locations. So they've really enjoyed that, and other leaders in our international offices have sort of replicated that, and some of them have done, you know, video blogs, and I know a couple of our offices have even had they've done sort of through the keyhole with some of the partners' homes. So definitely, I think people have got to know their leaders better, and I think that really helps with morale. And with the Senior Partners blog, he has received so many stories from people just sharing, you know, their experiences, which he's then been able to take and sort of refer to in future blogs. So I think you know, that is very, very important for people to feel that we're all in this together and we're going through it together.
Yeah, I love that idea. That's really great. So we're shortly going to sort of open up for questions from the audience in a minute. So just to remind everyone, if they want to send in a question, now is the time to do so. Sarah, I wanted to ask you, also at the conference, you are facilitating a session all about loneliness. And I know, as Tony, you know, rightly reminded us, that you can now go for a walk or whatever with somebody else, you know, meet somebody from a different household outside. But that doesn't mean that people aren't getting lonely, still working day in, day out at home during these times, perhaps on their own. Any suggestions on, you know, even for people to help themselves, not only just putting it all on the manager, but, you know, helping themselves to stay motivated and mentally well?
Yeah, I think loneliness and isolation is something that we really need to think about going into this second lockdown period. Actually, not just for people. I think when we think about loneliness and isolation, we often think about people who are on their own. You can feel incredibly lonely, even in a house full of people. Even with, you know, a spouse there, children there, perhaps you're living with flatmates, you can still feel incredibly lonely. So I think it's really important for managers and colleagues to kind of remember that and don't just be worried from a loneliness point of view of people who are living on their own. Obviously, it does affect those living on their own in a different way. And we know that also this Christmas period that's coming up, I'm sure you all remember that every year there's a lot of campaigns by organisations such as Age UK about the loneliness that people are facing at Christmas, and that could end up being even more acute this year as well. So I think in terms of making the use of that extra little bit of contact that we have now with being able to meet one person outside, even if you can't physically meet somebody else outside because you don't live near to your friends or whatever. We were talking before about having a phone call. So combine your exercise and that contact with somebody at the same time. There's also a lot of interesting research showing that it's not just about the number of contacts that you have that help with isolation, but the variety of contacts you have, the diversity, if you will, of contacts that you have. So it's better to phone a different person 5 days in a row than the same person 5 days in a row. That actually combats isolation and loneliness, even in a virtual world. That combats isolation and loneliness as well. So yeah, don't just think about the number of times you could meet somebody or call somebody, but the actual variety of people that you're able to connect with as well.
Again, hugely useful and practical information coming here. So thank you, Sarah, sorry. Thank you, Sarah. Monica, just also turning to you with regards to the conference. I mean, you are talking at the conference about why are we still having this mental health conversation? Well, this lockdown is proving exactly why. But perhaps you'll talk about a little bit about what you're talking about and why mental health at this time is just so important.
Sure, thanks, Zoe. We're seeing more and more companies setting an ambition around workplace mental health. And so my talk is really going to be around what are the barriers to realizing that ambition, and how can we overcome some of those barriers. So what's GSK doing to overcome some of those barriers with a view to helping those companies to move forward with progressing their agenda?
Okay, great. So I'm just going to have a look at the questions that are coming through. So while I'm just having a quick look at them to pose to you, for everybody who wants to know a little bit more about what's coming up in the conference in about 2 weeks' time, please take a look at this.
It's important that we start this momentum where we just take mental health more seriously. There's still a stigma about mental health. We are chipping away at it, but that wall needs to be smashed down, and this is a fantastic forum for beating the stigma of mental health.
Well, that looks exciting. So yes, we've had quite a few questions coming in here. So I'm just, apologies, I'm looking down. I'm just looking at all the questions. So I think, Tony, I'm just going to start with you with this question, but open for anybody else as well. Somebody has said, I'm at quite a junior level and don't believe my company have been supporting us enough when it comes to mental health. I can't leave my job now for understandable reasons. Just feel a little scared to approach anyone about it. What are your thoughts?
Well, that sounds like a really tough situation to be in. I mean, I would say, first of all, if you can share with somebody, even if it's not someone at your workplace, even just being able to talk through with someone else some of the things that you're feeling and thinking can help you to sort of make sense of them and to sort of make a plan around what you might do. And then secondly, you don't necessarily have to approach your line manager. You could talk to your HR team if you feel that you know them well enough, and they will always be supportive and they should treat your conversation in confidence. So you could try doing that. And what I found is that once, you know, if an employer doesn't know there's an issue, they can't do anything about it. In my experience, once they understand what the issue is, they will generally try to help. So it might feel like a really big step to actually go and speak to someone, but if there is somebody either in the HR team, maybe in a different part of the business so that they're slightly more independent, that you can, you know, just take that first step, then, you know, I would suggest you do that. Other alternatives, and it depends on your employer, but you may have an EAP in place, so you might be able to call the EAP line, and that will also be confidential. There may also be other organisations. So, for example, for us in the legal profession, there's an organisation called Law Care, and they literally specialise in sort of providing support for people in the legal profession, not just lawyers, but anyone working in that industry. So it's worth finding out if there are things like that too, and places you could go where you could speak to other people.
Okay, great. Do either of you want to add to that?
Zoe, I'd just say, you know, try to ask some questions, have some conversations to perhaps understand and dig a little bit more in terms of where the hesitancy to offer more support might be coming from. You know, as Tony said, get some allies around you, but try and ask some questions. Is it perhaps a fear that it's going to cost a lot of money to help? In which case, go and research some free things that you could suggest. Is it a lack of time? You know, whoever might be responsible for this feels that they just wouldn't have time to put everything together. So again, perhaps you can gather together a group of volunteers and allies and say, we can help you, with this. So I think trying to understand where the hesitancy is coming from could maybe provide some useful answers as well.
Great idea. I've got lots of questions coming in here, so apologies if I'm looking down. But Monica, I'd like to come to you on this one. Someone said, as a business services manager, I find it hard to check in on people without feeling like I'm micromanaging and checking up on people. What's the best way to do this?
Great question. Thank you. What I would suggest is that you have a conversation with each individual separately and ask them how they would like how they would like their channels of communication with you. And often that can be a really non-threatening way to find out what works for them, as opposed to feeling like you're encroaching and potentially micromanaging. So have a conversation early on. I really want to connect with you. What's the best frequency, duration, and is it Zoom, is it walk and talk? So the more input you get from your employee, the less likely you will feel uncomfortable about reaching out to them.
Yes, okay, great. And to Sarah, I'm going to ask this. Sorry, I really need to have my glasses on. The question is, have you got any practical tips for supporting employees in creating better boundaries between work and home? Remote working seems to mean that working day is getting longer and longer.
Yeah, so I think there's two responsibilities here. I think there's the responsibility of the organisation and doing what they can in terms of setting parameters and structures and just a general culture within each team about what's expected and more importantly what's not expected. And then I think there's the responsibility of self. I know when I've ended up working longer hours, frankly, it's mostly down to pressure that I'm putting on myself rather than, my boss overtly or not saying, oh, you must, do these extra hours. It's totally down to me. And you do therefore have to be really strict with yourself. I have, particularly because I cover Europe, Middle East, Africa and Asia Pacific, and my company is headquartered in the US, you can imagine that my day could end up being really, really quite long. And so I have sort of sacred hours where unless the world was about to collapse, I will never agree to have a call or a meeting during those sacred hours. Now, I'm different to Tony in that I'm much more of a night owl. So where needed, I'm happy to go into my evening, and I would much prefer to do that than have to get up at 6 a.m. for something. But I talk about that, and I talk about that openly with everybody. Everybody knows what my sacred hours are. And I find if you're more open with yourself about thinking about what those boundaries are and then communicating those with people, they know that if they need to, they can step into my evening, but it's got to be really, really super important if they want to step into my morning, and that could be completely different for somebody else. So I think you have to set those boundaries and reinforce them with people as much as you can.
Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Tony and Monica, I'm going to come to both of you on this one. I think you'll both recognise the importance of this question. Somebody says, how can we raise the subject of burnout with colleagues? Those most likely to be at risk will often be in denial or not want to acknowledge how they're feeling with colleagues. Tony, you work with partners in a very stressful environment, billable minutes. This must be something that potentially you come across.
Yeah, I think, definitely. I think part of it is about sort of education and helping people to, before they get to that point, helping people to understand and recognise possible signs and symptoms in themselves and also in their colleagues potentially. Interestingly, one of the first things we did when we started doing mental health first aid training a couple of years ago, we trained quite a few of our PAs in our London office because we felt that they were kind of at the centre of a lot of the teams and were quite well placed to sort of notice if somebody appeared to be struggling a little bit. If you're trying to approach somebody and they're not sort of forthcoming, it is quite difficult. I think you can you can approach someone and you can say what you have seen. So I noticed that, you know, and I know it's difficult because we're virtual, but you can still see people's faces and see some of their body language. You know, I noticed that on our call the other day, you know, you didn't seem like yourself, or you didn't, you know, you didn't join in the conversation. Is everything okay? And people might not open up straight away, but if you can leave the door open so that they know that they can talk to you, then they're likely to kind of come back. Sorry, my Siri just went off in the background.
It's fine. Didn't hear a thing. Monica, is there anything you would like to add to that?
I would say that some of our resilience programs, and a lot of our employees have been through them, we really talk about symptoms. So what do you like when you're at your best? What do you like when you're about to tip over the edge? And so I agree that education and training is really, self-awareness is the key through the training that we provide. So if people can themselves identify those signs, that's obviously ideal. But obviously sometimes people are so in that zone that they don't really see themselves as struggling. And so it's really important for our colleagues or our managers to look out for any changes in behaviour or performance, and talk to those people early on. So yeah, couldn't agree more with what Tony said. And also I think the importance of educating people at scale about those warning signs that they may have.
And Monica, just staying with you for a second, somebody has asked any ideas on additional things to consider, think about regarding winter well-being now?
It's a really good point. I'm personally struggling with going out. In the summer, I would go for a walk at 8 p.m. sometimes, and it was still really light and very mild. And now it's so much earlier that we're experiencing the darkness and the cold, and it's often raining. But one thing that I've committed to is actually going out irrespective of the weather, because you know we can all get a bigger umbrella and we can all get Wellington boots, so why not go and do that for a change of scene? So I really do think that we need to do that. But I really liked what you'd said earlier, Zoe, about other companies encouraging people to go out in the day. So where you can have autonomy over how you work, I recommend that you do block out an hour in the daytime to get that daylight, and then make that time up later on.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Okay, so I think, Sarah, I'm going to come to you for this one, and we've probably got time for one more after this. A lot of companies have made cuts. How can you recommend ensuring that teams are not feeling overwhelmed? Even though teams have extensive SLAs, the teams still are taking on this pressure today. It's a very good point.
Yeah, it is, and it's another reality of this pandemic that a lot of individuals are facing. You know, many people have lost their jobs or had their hours reduced or their contracts significantly changed already, and there's no doubt that we're going to see more of that as the global economy continues to struggle. I think it's really important, particularly for managers and teams, to get out in front of that, to almost address the elephant in the room. Obviously, they're not necessarily going to have information that they can share, but just to actually bring out in team meetings, in one-to-ones, to say, I know we're all worried at the moment about the economy, about jobs and so forth, and actually give people almost the permission to talk about that, and the permission to talk about the fears that they may have around that, even if there's no immediate solutions or reassurance that they can give. Just talking about it rather than leaving it as the sort of elephant in the room, I think is really, really important. And just being aware that will increase as we get to year end. We've spoken about burnout, adrenaline and so forth as well. Those usually become more critical in a normal year, and they will be even more so, felt even more so this year. So just be aware. I am particularly worried about the mental health in organisations when we come back in January. I think a lot of people are hanging on at the moment, frankly, for the end of the year, hanging on for that week or two that many people are able to take as annual leave in the Christmas New Year period. And I think a lot of people consciously or unconsciously are pinning a lot of hope on that being the rest that they need to get themselves, back on track again, mentally and physically. And I worry that this lockdown period and everything that's surrounding the pandemic means that it actually won't be that mental health break that we're perhaps hoping that it all will be.
I think you make a very, very good point there, and that's probably, a really good discussion for us to have in January about how to get everybody back on track, where perhaps the break hasn't been as much of a break as it would have been previously. So just looking at some of the sort of positive comments that have come in, to say, love the idea of virtual Christmas party, using Zoom or Microsoft Teams for regular social interaction is important. We always have a virtual coffee corner. So that's nice to know. Somebody has said, somebody's just said they're using their champions. Oh, I've just lost it. That they're using their champions in a really positive way to interact with everybody so much more than they ever have done. And that's been proving to be really useful. But thank you, everyone. I think we've had a really great conversation today. We've had nearly 300 people today watching on LinkedIn, YouTube and Facebook. So thank you so much for joining us. To Monica, to Tony and to Sarah, thank you so much for your time today, for answering questions and giving your points of view. It's been great having you, and thank you everybody else for joining us and asking questions. We look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks at the conference.